Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and discusses 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. In recent years, there have been massive migratory waves, particularly into Europe and the United States. However, there is also deep and widespread disagreement over how the nations to which these large number of migrants are headed should deal with this situation. Some believe that they should prioritize the migrants' right to a better life. Others that they should prioritize the nation's common good whenever unrestricted immigration could be deeply harmful to that country's economy, culture, and local communities. In navigating these debates, Catholics need to ensure that their guiding principles are evangelical rather than ideological. For this reason, they need to know and unpack the Church's authoritative teachings on the right to migrate. That's easier said than done. There is much debate over what that teaching actually is, or over whether concrete policies are legitimate applications rather than misguided applications of that teaching. In this interview, Antônio Lemos discusses his pick of the 5 best books for learning about the Church's teaching on the right to migrate. Antônio Lemos is a Catholic moral theologian, and presently he's a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, where he recently submitted a dissertation entitled The Right to Travel and Dwell in Francisco de Vitoria and Domingo de Soto, a historical retrieval of the right to migrate in Catholic social teaching. The books recommended and discussed in this episode are, first, On the American Indians by Francisco de Vitoria. Second, Deliberation on the Cause of the Poor by Domingo de Soto. Third, Exul Familiam by Pius XII. Fourth, Christ's Love Towards Migrants, Erga Migrantes Caritas Christi, by the Pontifical Council for the Pastoral Care of Migrants and Itinerant People. And fifth, Migrants and Refugees, Witnesses to Hope, a collection of discourses by Pope Francis edited by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode and on the website. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Antônio Lemos, welcome.
Thank you, Father Dominic.
First of all, this is a very controversial topic we're going to broach today. But does the Church teach that there's a natural right to migrate?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Sometimes when I talk to people, they get very surprised. Especially first of all, when you see what the popes taught in the 20th century, there is an unanimous voice among the popes regarding the right to migrate. It really started with Pius XII. He had this document called Exul Familia. It's about the family, the Holy Family, going to Egypt, and he talks about the care for migrants in the church. In the encyclical, it's not encyclical; it's just a apostolic exhortation. But he talks about the natural right to migrate, which is a very bold statement. Means that, like, because of human nature, the human inclinations, we need, like, humans should be allowed to migrate to other countries. And he repeats that in several instances in radio message and speeches he gives in the Vatican. And after him, John the 23rd again repeats it. He has an encyclical very famous called Pacem in Terris about what are the most fundamental rights of that people have. And among these fundamental rights, such as right of freedom, right of life, he puts the right to migrate there. And then every single pope after him, Paul VI, John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis, all of them confirm and reaffirm that people have a right to migrate. Although Pius XII is the only one that said that that's a natural right, which is like those most basic fundamental rights, together with the right to leave, or the right to protect one's family, is the right to migrate. The other popes don't go that far. They say that we have a right to migrate that is based on the dignity of the human person. At times they say it's based on the universal destination of goods, which is a theological principle that means that people, God created the earth for the good of all human beings. Uh, so they don't go as far to saying that it's a natural right. But another interesting thing also is that although they say people have a right to migrate, all the popes, including Pius XII, they say that this right is not limited. That it's a right that has some. It should be regulated by each state according to the common good, according to the security of each state, etc.
You've just mentioned the modern papal teaching on the right to migrate. Does sacred scripture offer any clear teachings on the right to migrate, the duty to welcome migrants, or the limits of such a duty?
Yeah. So the scriptures do not mention explicitly the right to migrate, as scriptures also do not mention explicitly many other rights, right? For example, the right of political participation, which is a very common right in modern times. There's no like uh, there's no explicit reference to it. But there's implicit reference for the basis of that right. For example, the Bible is full of reference to hospitality, right? And or like full of reference about welcoming strangers. Being kind and charitable towards those who come from outside, foreigners, for example. Um, there was many of these references are in the Old Testament. There are some of those references also uh, in the Gospel. The way people Jesus received people and was kind to people and received them, but especially in the letters of St. Paul. St. Paul has some very clear reference about hospitality. There is one of his letters. He talks about how many people being hospitable to strangers, they were receiving angels without knowing them. And that's important. Like the basis of the right to migrate, as the many popes have insisted, is the idea of Christian hospitality, biblical hospitality. But there's one little detail about that is that again, it's not explicit reference to allow migrants to come into one's country, right? So we're not talking here about sovereignty, about regulation of borders. So some scholars they point out that okay, like we're talking about hospitality, but what does that hospitality mean? Does it mean just receiving a traveler who needs a place to stay for a few days? Yes, does it mean to receive any traveler from outside, from other countries, or maybe travelers from the neighbor city, from the same country? What does hospitality? So there's a debate about what hospitality means, and that's why it's important to read the scripture together with tradition and how that passage is received throughout the century by Christians.
Well, that brings me to my next question. Do any of the church fathers address this issue in detail?
Yeah. So again, there's a limited way on what we can say about explicit right to migrate, like the Pope said in the 20th century. There's no church father that goes that far, but again, they set the basis for it. So we have some letters from Saint Cyprian of Carthage, one of the most important fathers, second, third century, and in these letters, he over and over again calls his friends, his community to be hospitable to travelers, to foreigners. there's a letter in which he tells some of his friends and some people in his community that they should use his own money, Cyprian's money, to receive travelers and offer whatever they need. And that's very interesting. Another way that we can see migration, the fathers, is through the idea of the universal destination of goods. So the fathers, starting with St. Ambrose, St. Basil, St. Augustine, uh, very important to St. John Chrysostom, they talk about this idea that when God created the earth, he thought that the goods of the earth should serve the flourishing of all human beings. And no people should be set apart and be hindered to get those goods that they need for their flourishing. And that is what we it became known as the principle of the universal destination of goods. People should have access to all the goods, the land, the fruits, the water, the things they need for their survival and for their flourishing. When the popes in the 20th century, especially John Paul II, he talks, and also Pope Benedict, they talk about the right to migrate. They go all the way back to the fathers like St. Ambrose, St. Basil, St. John Chrysostom, and they make reference to that principle, the universal destination of goods, who is also very present in medieval theologians such as St. Thomas Aquinas. And they say, look, migrants should have access and be able to relocate to other countries if in the place where they live, they don't have access to those goods that are important for their flourishing, for their family. So in that way, we can see how the fathers point out to the right to migrate. Usually they talk about the right in the situation of the poor and how people who have means for their flourish should share their means with the poor. And in a way, we can say, yeah, the migrants very often they're poor. They don't have the means they need. So those who have those means, have access to the goods of the earth, they should allow the poor to have access to it as well.
Some might want a quick summary of the Church's teaching on the right to migrate and a nation's duty to welcome migrants. Does the Catechism of the Catholic Church in number 2241 provide a complete summation of this teaching, or does it leave something out?
I think it's a very good summary, that number. The number will talk about, how migrants should be welcome, but also what I like that number, Father, is that the number also talks about the duty of the state to protect its borders. So the state both needs to be generous and receive those migrants, especially those who are in most need. Think about refugees of war, for example, or economic migrants who do not have access to resources, but also has a duty to oversee its borders and reinforce its sovereignty and make sure that the common good is in place in their own communities and the rule of law is observed, there is authority, etc. So I like that number because it kind of puts the two realities together. But the other thing is like, well, but like how when do you know when to receive a migrant or instead say no to the migrant in order to secure the borders and preserve the common good? And then the situation get more complex. And I think that's when it's useful to go back to what the popes are teaching, the way they explore the subjects. And there are plenty of resources in Catholic social teaching. And then after that, go back in history and see how the fathers of the church were dealing with the situation, how medieval theologians and the Catholic tradition deals with that to complete that teaching.
I'm going to begin a bit of a long question here, with a question with a rather long premise. So the right to migrate appears to be more of a negative than a positive right. A right's negative whenever it consists in the moral entitlement to be immune from violent or coercive restriction when pursuing a certain end. The natural right to religious liberty is, for example, a negative right. So is the nubile adult's natural right to marry. It's wrong to impede a nubile adult from marrying should that person choose to. However, the natural right to marry does not entail that a nubile adult can demand that the partner of his or her choice must accept their marriage proposal. And it
Hmm.
seems to me the right to migrate is somewhat similar. It's a natural right, but it's also negative, but its specification is not natural. Whose child one is specified by birth, namely nature, but not whose spouse one is. And similarly, the right to migrate is akin to marriage in this the right to marry in this case. Those exercising that right may not be impeded from migrating to another country, but that does not entitle them to residency or citizenship to any country they choose. And this sometimes I
Yeah,
think is overlooked. Am I correct
yeah,
in understanding the right to migrate in this way?
yeah. I like to the way you present it. That reminds me of a very important aspect of migration ethics for the Catholic Church, which is the right to migrate. As you mentioned, negative right. No one should be forced to migrate, right? And that's why the popes also point out that together with the right to migrate, there is a right called the right not to migrate. Sometimes they call also the right to remain or the right to stay. Pope Francis called it the freedom to stay or migrate, which is the idea that, on the first place, when we we study the phenomenon of migration of our times, very often is a phenomenon of like forced migration. Okay, people, because of war, because of poverty, because of political persecution, they feel forced or compelled to leave their country, and that's dysfunctional. Human communities should not operate on that level. Uh, so people, on the first place, they should feel free whether to migrate or not, and they should feel free to choose to stay in their homeland and live and have a dignified life there, and provide for their families there. So that's what the popes call the right to stay or the right not to migrate. The first pope to mention that was Leo the 13th. So in Rerum Novarum, he has this interesting idea. He's talking about the importance of allowing people to have private property and having like assets of their own, especially the workers. And he's like, look, if people are not allowed to have property, they'll be forced to leave their country. So in a way, to allow people to have property is a way to uh, allow them to be free to stay in their homeland. And then later Pope, especially John Paul II, Pope Benedict, stressed that a lot. People should not feel forced to migrate. And I think it goes. That's an important idea because the right to migrate is a negative right. No one should be forced to migrate. Um, Also, states should not be forced to accept migrants, right? The states should be able to discern how many migrants they can receive, why, when, who, etc. So
That last point seems to appear that the church's understanding of the right to migrate is quite different from some of the theories which are in vogue in mainstream political philosophy, where cosmopolitanism
mhm.
is the prevalent view. In other words, the idea that the nation state should be redimensioned in favor of internationalism or cosmopolitanism.
Yeah,
How does the church's understanding of the right to immigrate differ from this cosmopolitan view that's quite prevalent today in academic philosophy?
yeah. Uh, Very recently, I read a paper in which the author said that the teaching of the church it's mainly not about like this broad idea of cosmopolitanism, but what he called moral cosmopolitanism. That good of human beings should go beyond borders, etc. But still, there is an important place that we need to hold for the sovereignty of each state and each community to decide about their laws, and decide about their lives. And I think the church tried to do a good job about balancing both, about when people have rights across borders, but also placing the role about deciding about that, the concrete aspects about that. When should we receive migrants? Why? How? Each state should be allowed to do that, and the church emphasized a lot the role of the state instead of like creating like some type of organization about the state or allow other states to decide that. No, like each state should be allowed. As we mentioned, the catechism is very clear that each state should be able to secure its borders, etc. Although there is a very moral case to that we should make, and each state should work on that, about the idea that there should be generous policies to welcome migrants, especially those that have a greater need.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.